What if the final fracture in the British royal family wasn't about titles, fame, or even public image, but about something far more personal, far more intimate? The future of two innocent children. Imagine, for a moment, a grandfather staring at a sealed envelope in the quiet of Buckingham Palace, the golden chandeliers casting long shadows across a room steeped in centuries of tradition. On the other side of the world, his son and daughter-in-law sit tens of thousands of miles away in California, sipping coffee under the warm glow of the West Coast sun, discussing the most basic, yet potentially explosive, question: who will pay for Archie and Lilibet's education? It sounds almost mundane, doesn't it? School fees are the sort of conversation ordinary families have every year. But in the world of royalty, in a household where legacy, privilege, and protocol collide, even something as simple as a financial request can spark a chain reaction with consequences that echo far beyond the palace walls. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The tension in this story isn't merely about money. It's about boundaries, respect, and the delicate balance between family loyalty and institutional authority. King Charles, now the reigning monarch, bears the weight of centuries of responsibility. Every decision he makes sends ripples through the monarchy, through public perception, and through the private corridors of family life that are hidden from the public eye. So when news emerged that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had allegedly requested royal support for their children's schooling, the palace reportedly did not take it lightly. Not just because of the financial implications, but because of what the request represented: a breach in expectations, a challenge to unspoken rules, a confrontation with the very definition of independence within the royal family. To fully understand why this moment has sent shockwaves through the monarchy, we need to zoom in on the individuals involved. King Charles has spent decades preparing for the throne, watching over his children, witnessing the highs and lows of their lives, and learning to navigate the treacherous waters of public scrutiny. His relationship with Prince Harry has always been complicated. On the one hand, there is the fatherly love, the bond forged in shared history and blood. On the other, there is the tension born from Harry's rebellious streak, his insistence on independence, and the very public decisions that have challenged the traditional royal order. Meghan Markle, meanwhile, occupies a unique and controversial place in the story. To her supporters, she is a figure of courage, someone who dared to step out of centuries of rigid expectations. To detractors, she is a disruptor, a catalyst for conflict, whose presence has changed the very dynamics of the royal family. And at the center of all of this are Archie and Lilibet, two children born into one of the most scrutinized families in the world, whose futures have suddenly become the focal point of a family crisis. The story begins quietly, in that ordinary yet extraordinary way that only royal life can produce. According to palace insiders, the request for financial assistance did not arrive as a bombshell delivered with fanfare or aggression. Instead, it came as a conversation, a polite inquiry, framed by concern for the children's future. And yet, within the walls of Buckingham Palace, every word carried weight. The financial ask was interpreted as a challenge to the institution itself. It wasn't just about paying tuition, it was about precedent. If the royal family were to fund the schooling of Harry and Meghan's children, what message would that send? How would it affect the perception of other family members, other heirs, other institutions dependent on the monarchy? What would it signal to the public, who watch every royal move with intense fascination, often interpreting gestures and decisions as statements about character, loyalty, and morality? But beyond the institutional ramifications, there is the human story, the one that rarely reaches the headlines. King Charles, the father, reportedly faced an internal struggle unlike any other. Here was his son, the young man he had known since infancy, the boy who had once run through palace gardens and played with toy soldiers, now asking for help. And yet, Harry was no longer a boy. He was a man with a life of his own, living abroad, forging a path outside the monarchy. The king had to reconcile these competing identities: the son he loves and the monarch he must protect. How do you balance the warmth of familial affection with the cold imperatives of tradition? How do you respond to a request from a child who has chosen, in many ways, to step outside the very system that raised him? And what about Meghan, who, through her own lens, sees this request not as a challenge, but as a rightful consideration for the well-being of her children. These layers of perspective create a tension that is both deeply personal and profoundly public, a crucible where love, duty, and pride collide. What makes this story even more compelling is the timing. The royal family has been navigating numerous pressures, public scrutiny over finances, controversies surrounding past interviews, and the ongoing evolution of King Charles's role in a modernizing monarchy. In that context, Harry and Meghan's request was more than just a question. It was a test. A test of loyalty, a test of boundaries, and perhaps even a test of love. Some insiders suggest that the request was framed as a simple conversation about schooling, but it triggered alarm bells in multiple directions. Advisors worried about the optics. The king weighed the potential for precedent. And somewhere in the background, the public eye loomed, watching, judging, waiting for a crack in the polished facade of the monarchy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Harry and Meghan faced their own dilemmas. The request for financial support, while practical in nature, carried emotional weight. How would it be received? Would it be seen as reasonable, entitled, or even provocative? How would the media interpret it? How would it affect their relationship with the rest of the family? The couple reportedly discussed the matter in careful tones, considering both the practicalities of education costs and the symbolic resonance of asking for help from a family from which they had distanced themselves. And as they debated, the shadows of past conflicts, interviews, public statements, family tensions, hung over every word, every decision, every nuance. It is here that the drama intensifies. The palace reportedly did not respond immediately. Silence, in this context, is a statement. Delay becomes judgment, and when King Charles finally made his position known, insiders say the reaction was resolute. Not just a polite refusal, not merely a logistical negotiation, but a decision with far-reaching implications. The alleged response sent shockwaves through the family, reverberated in the media, and sparked intense speculation among royal watchers. What did it mean for Harry and Meghan? What did it mean for the children, for the future of the monarchy, for the fragile balance between family and institution? And how would this decision, made behind closed doors, eventually leak into the public consciousness, creating a storm of commentary, judgment, and speculation? As the story unfolds, one detail becomes increasingly clear. This is not merely about money. It is about principles. It is about power. It is about identity and belonging. It is about a grandfather trying to uphold the integrity of an ancient institution while struggling to maintain the love and connection he feels for his son. It is about a father confronting choices that have no easy answers. And it is about a couple navigating the delicate terrain of independence, responsibility, and the protection of their children, all under the watchful eyes of the world. So tonight, as we explore this unfolding drama, we must ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to be royal? What obligations exist between generations, between individuals, and between the personal and the institutional? How much can a father forgive? How much can a son expect? And how will two children, Archie and Lilibet, whose lives are already entwined with history, fare as their family navigates what may be the most critical decision of their young lives? But what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Because according to palace insiders, the moment the king's decision was delivered, a chain reaction began, one that would redefine relationships, reshape expectations, and set the stage for a confrontation that no one, not even the most seasoned royal watcher, could have anticipated. And that, dear viewers, is where our story truly begins. What if one simple question could shatter decades of family bonds? One request, so ordinary in the eyes of the world, that it would ignite a private storm behind palace walls, a storm that no one could contain? That is exactly what insiders say happened when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle allegedly approached the royal household with a single inquiry. Could the royal family cover the educational expenses for their two children, Archie and Lilibet? On the surface, it seems innocuous, almost practical. After all, parents everywhere worry about school fees, boarding costs, and ensuring their children have access to the best opportunities. But in the unique ecosystem of the British monarchy, where symbolism outweighs practicality and every word carries layers of meaning, this was no ordinary request. To the palace, it was a signal, a challenge, and, according to some reports, a line that could not be crossed. To understand the gravity of this request, it's crucial to consider the context. Prince Harry had, by this point, taken deliberate steps to establish financial independence from the crown. He and Meghan had moved across the Atlantic, built a life in California, and created ventures that were designed to fund their lifestyle without relying on royal support. That independence was celebrated by some, criticized by others, and scrutinized relentlessly by the media. And yet, when it came to the education of their children, Harry and Meghan reportedly felt that some support from the family institution would be appropriate. Perhaps they saw it as a shared responsibility, a continuation of a tradition that had always supported royal heirs. Or perhaps they believed it was a pragmatic decision, one that could ensure their children's safety, security, and access to elite institutions without creating financial strain. From the perspective of the palace, however, the request carried implications far beyond mere dollars and pounds. Paying for Harry and Meghan's children was not simply a matter of tuition. It raised questions about precedent. If the monarch were to fund the education of children whose parents had actively distanced themselves from royal duties, what message would that send to other family members? To staff? To the public? Would it signal favoritism, undermine the authority of the reigning king, or suggest that privilege could be requested rather than earned? Insiders described the mood in Buckingham Palace as one of shock and disbelief. It wasn't the money, one source allegedly said. It was the principle of it. And principles, in that house, are everything. What makes the scenario even more volatile is the timing. At this point, the monarchy was navigating multiple pressures. Media scrutiny over finances, criticism of King Charles's spending habits, public debates about the relevance of monarchy in the modern era, and ongoing tension following Harry and Meghan's departure. The last thing the king reportedly wanted was another situation that could be interpreted as indulgence, favoritism, or weakness. And yet, here it was, a request delivered not with pomp or ceremony, but through private channels, polite in tone yet explosive in content. Harry and Meghan, of course, reportedly had their reasons. Beyond the financial logistics, there was the emotional and symbolic aspect. The couple wanted their children to have the same opportunities as other royal children, to maintain a connection to their heritage, and to feel included in the legacy of the family even from a distance. They framed the request, insiders say, as practical, reasonable, and focused on the best interests of Archie and Lilibet. But what seemed reasonable in California was interpreted very differently in the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace. According to palace insiders, the request triggered intense debate among advisors and family members. Some urged compassion, arguing that supporting the children did not undermine the authority of the king or the institution. They reminded the household that these were, after all, young children with no control over the actions of their parents, and that failing to provide support could be seen as cruel. Others warned of the dangerous precedent, noting that if financial support were granted, it might encourage similar requests in the future or be misinterpreted by the media as preferential treatment. These debates, though largely behind closed doors, were described as tense, emotional, and at times bitter, with loyalty and principle clashing at every turn. What intensified the drama even further was the personal history between Harry and his father. The request was not happening in a vacuum. It was part of a larger narrative of perceived slights, misunderstandings, and public disputes. Harry had, in recent years, expressed frustrations with the monarchy, detailing feelings of neglect, lack of support, and pressure from the media. Meghan had also faced intense scrutiny and criticism, which the couple often described as hostile and unfair. The request for educational funding, while practical, became entangled with these broader emotional and psychological dynamics. It was a lightning rod for all the unresolved tension between father and son, between the institution and its renegade members. Adding another layer of complexity was the question of public perception. The royal family is, by design, an institution that relies on optics as much as reality. Every decision, every gesture, every allocation of resources is scrutinized not just internally, but externally, by media, analysts, and the public. Granting support for Harry and Meghan's children could be perceived as favoritism, weakness, or a failure to uphold the standards expected of royal leadership. Denying it could be seen as cold, punitive, or vindictive. In that delicate balance, every choice carried risk, and according to insiders, the king's advisors were acutely aware of the stakes. In California, meanwhile, the couple reportedly approached the conversation with a mix of hope and trepidation. They understood the implications of the request, but framed it as a practical solution for the well-being of their children. They were navigating uncharted territory, balancing independence with familial connection, and seeking compromise without confrontation. Yet, as palace insiders would later recount, the delivery of the request, no matter how polite or careful, triggered reactions that none of them could have anticipated. It was, in many ways, a perfect storm. Timing, history, perception, and principle collided in a way that would set the stage for dramatic consequences. And then came the initial response, which, according to multiple sources, was not immediate. Silence, in the royal context, is a statement in itself. The king reportedly took time to consider the request, consulting advisors, reflecting on precedent, and weighing the potential impact on the institution he now leads. That pause, far from being neutral, created an atmosphere of suspense and uncertainty. Harry and Meghan, already anxious, waited for a response that would shape their future and that of their children in ways they could scarcely imagine. But when the king finally responded, it was decisive. Insiders describe it as a response that went beyond the financial question, touching on principles, family dynamics, and the boundaries of independence. It was not merely a refusal. It was a signal that lines had been drawn, that expectations were being clarified, and that the request had crossed a threshold. For Harry and Meghan, according to reports, the response was chilling. It confirmed fears that distance, independence, and past decisions could come at a steep personal cost. And for the palace, it was a reaffirmation of authority, a statement that the institution must endure above all personal sentiment. Yet the story does not end with the decision itself. The aftermath, insiders say, was a series of cascading effects. Private conversations, public speculation, and emotional fallout began almost immediately. Advisors debated messaging. The media picked up on leaks, and the royal household braced for the inevitable questions from a public intensely interested in every detail. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan navigated the emotional terrain of rejection, disappointment, and concern for their children. Archie and Lilibet, of course, were entirely innocent in this conflict. Yet their futures had suddenly become a battleground between family loyalty and institutional authority. What makes this chapter of the story so compelling is the way it encapsulates multiple layers of conflict at once. Personal versus institutional, father versus son, principle versus emotion, independence versus legacy. Every element of the request, and the response it triggered, serves as a lens through which we can examine the intricate, often painful dynamics of a family under pressure, a monarchy under scrutiny, and children caught in the crossfire. And while the request itself may seem small, its impact, according to insiders, was seismic. The alleged request for educational support was more than just a practical matter. It became a catalyst for a broader reckoning. With loyalty, with family bonds, with the responsibilities of tradition, and with the consequences of independence. Every decision, every word, every pause carried weight, shaping relationships in ways that could not easily be undone. And as the palace prepared to respond, as advisors whispered in hallways, and as Harry and Meghan awaited a reply across the ocean, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. One that would test not only personal relationships, but the very foundations of the monarchy itself. But what truly alarmed the palace, insiders say, was not the money. It was the implications, a challenge to the expectations of royal life, a questioning of boundaries, and a reminder that family, even at the highest levels, is never simple. That one request, for the education of 2 children, had ignited debates, fueled anxiety, and set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated. And as the king prepared to deliver his decision, the question lingered. What would it mean for Harry and Meghan, for Archie and Lilibet, and for the family as a whole? Because according to palace sources, When the final response reached Harry and Meghan, it would mark the beginning of a rift that some insiders fear may never fully heal. And that rift, born of a single, seemingly ordinary request, would go on to define the next chapter of a story that has captured the attention of the world. What happens when the weight of centuries rests on a single pair of shoulders? When every decision you make is scrutinized, analyzed, and debated by millions across the globe. King Charles found himself in exactly that position, caught between his duty as monarch and his love as a father. For decades, Charles had been preparing for this moment, the moment when he would ascend the throne and bear the ultimate responsibility for both his family and the monarchy itself. But nothing in those decades of preparation could have fully readied him for the delicate, explosive dilemma that arose when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle allegedly requested royal support for the education of Archie and Lilibet. At the heart of the king's struggle was a tension familiar to anyone in a position of leadership, but amplified in the gilded, scrutinized halls of Buckingham Palace. The balance between authority and empathy, between principle and personal attachment. Insiders suggest that Charles faced this request with a mixture of reflection and restraint, understanding both the practical and symbolic dimensions of what Harry and Meghan were asking. On the surface, it seemed simple: support the children, ensure they have access to quality education, and maintain a connection to the royal family. But Charles knew that nothing in his position is ever simple. Every choice carries a ripple effect. Every decision echoes through the corridors of the palace and the pages of newspapers around the world. To fully appreciate the pressure Charles faced, consider the dual lenses through which he must view the request. On one side, there is the father, a man who has known Harry since infancy, who has witnessed his triumphs and missteps, and who loves him despite their differences. This father sees two grandchildren, innocent and deserving, whose futures might be enhanced by access to the very opportunities that are traditionally afforded to royal heirs. On the other side, there is the king, the institution, the sovereign entrusted with preserving the dignity, integrity, and reputation of the monarchy for generations to come. To make a decision favoring the children could be interpreted as favoritism. To refuse might appear harsh or cold. Every option carried risk, and every outcome would be dissected. Reports suggest that Charles spent hours reviewing the request, consulting with advisors, and weighing the potential consequences. Advisors reminded him of the optics, the public's expectations, the precedent that would be set, the subtle but profound messages sent to other family members. Some argued for generosity, framing it as a compassionate response to two children whose parents had made life choices that distanced them from the traditional royal path. Others warned that any form of financial support could be perceived as weakness, undermining the authority of the monarchy and opening the door to future requests or public criticism. In the palace, this debate was said to be intense, emotional, and at times painfully personal. Some aides reportedly described Charles as reflective, almost burdened, weighing not only the financial and institutional implications but the human ones as well. "He is a father first, a king second," one source allegedly said. But when you are king, the first always collides with the second, and there is no easy way to reconcile them. This collision of roles, father and monarch, created a pressure cooker environment where every decision became a test of character, judgment, and emotional resilience. The timing of the request added another layer of complexity. Charles had recently assumed the throne, a period of adjustment filled with scrutiny from both the media and the public. The monarchy was already navigating questions about relevance, finances, and tradition. The sudden emergence of this request put him in the spotlight in a very different way. It was not a ceremonial challenge or a political decision. It was intensely personal, directly tied to family, and yet inescapably public due to the nature of royal life. Every advisor, every aide, every whisper in the palace corridors had to be considered against the backdrop of the global stage on which the monarchy operates. Charles's advisors were reportedly divided. Some argued that supporting the children would be an act of kindness that reflected well on the king, demonstrating empathy and understanding for his grandchildren. Others countered that even small financial support could be weaponized by the media, portrayed as favoritism, and potentially undermine the authority of the monarchy. These discussions were described as meticulous, painstaking, and fraught with emotion. They required balancing compassion with principle, love with duty, and personal feelings with institutional obligations, a balance that few could fully understand from the outside. The personal stakes were no less daunting. Charles had long struggled with his relationship with Harry, marked by periods of closeness, misunderstanding, and public disagreements. The king's relationship with Meghan had always been delicate, shaped by media narratives, family opinions, and complex interpersonal dynamics. Each layer added emotional weight to the decision-making process. As one insider put it, this wasn't just a question of money. It was a question of trust, respect, and the boundaries of family versus institution. The pressure intensified because Charles was acutely aware that the world was watching. Every decision he made would be interpreted through multiple lenses: familial, political, cultural, and historical. To act one way might please some and provoke others. To hesitate could be read as indecision or weakness. To respond with authority risked being seen as cold or punitive. And all the while, the media would dissect every syllable, every gesture, and every official statement, constructing narratives that might or might not align with reality. As the days passed, tension reportedly mounted within the palace. Charles, according to insiders, consulted with close advisors, longtime confidants, and members of the household staff. He reviewed historical precedents, analyzed potential public reactions, and considered the emotional ramifications for all parties involved. It was a painstaking process, one that required extraordinary patience, diplomacy, and foresight. At the same time, he reportedly reflected privately on his role as a father, weighing how to maintain love and connection with Harry while upholding the responsibilities of his position. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan, unaware of the full deliberations, were navigating their own anxieties. They reportedly understood the magnitude of the request, aware that it might trigger conflict, yet believed it was reasonable. They framed it as a practical matter for the well-being of their children, not a challenge to authority. But in the palace, where symbolism outweighs practicality, this distinction mattered little. Every word, every gesture, and every intention was interpreted through the lens of centuries of royal precedent, family history, and public scrutiny. According to multiple sources, the internal debate was intense, with advisors emphasizing both caution and empathy. Some argued that the king needed to maintain a firm line, preserving the dignity and authority of the monarchy above all else. Others urged him to remember the human cost, the potential pain for his son, his daughter-in-law, and most importantly, the children. He was torn, one insider allegedly revealed, because in his heart, he wanted to do what was right for them as a family. But as king, he had a responsibility that was larger than his own heart. The pressure was compounded by public awareness of the family dynamics. The world knew about Harry and Meghan's departure, the Sussexes' interviews, and their public statements about struggles within the royal family. Each of these elements added to the stakes, creating a situation where every private decision had enormous public implications. Charles had to consider not just what was right or fair, but what was sustainable, defensible, and consistent with the expectations placed upon him as the sovereign. And then there was the issue of precedent, a concept that carries extraordinary weight in the monarchy. Charles reportedly considered the message that approving the request would send, not just to Harry and Meghan, but to other members of the family, to the public, and to future generations. Would it imply that royal privileges could be requested selectively? Would it blur the lines between personal favor and institutional responsibility? Every possible interpretation was analyzed, debated, and considered. The emotional weight of the decision cannot be overstated. Charles, like any father, wanted to support his grandchildren, to ensure their happiness, safety, and opportunities. But he also had to consider the broader ramifications of his choice. Every action, every refusal, every statement was magnified, and the consequences would extend far beyond the immediate situation. This was not merely a question of money or convenience. It was a defining moment for family, monarchy, and legacy. When Charles finally communicated his response, it was reportedly deliberate, measured, and resolute. Sources suggest that it went beyond a simple yes or no. It was a statement of principle, a delineation of boundaries, and an affirmation of his role as monarch. The decision, while private, sent shockwaves through the family, creating ripples that would be felt for months to come. The implications were profound. Harry and Meghan faced not only a refusal but a clear message about the limits of support, independence, and expectation within the royal structure. And yet, despite the firmness of the decision, the story was far from over. The king remained a father, aware of the delicate emotional consequences for his son and grandchildren. He reportedly reflected on the tension between duty and love, authority and compassion, and understood that the consequences of this decision would shape relationships for years to come. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan had to navigate the emotional fallout, processing the implications for their children, their family, and their own sense of independence. In the world of royalty, there are no simple choices. Every act is both personal and public. Every decision carries historical weight, and every response shapes perceptions for generations. For King Charles, the pressure was unimaginable to those outside the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace. He had to consider financial implications, familial bonds, institutional integrity, and public perception simultaneously. The weight of centuries rested upon him, and every move mattered. But what came next would escalate the tension even further. According to insiders, once the decision was delivered, it was not just a matter of policy. It became a catalyst for a series of reactions, responses, and emotional confrontations that would redefine relationships within the family. The king had made his choice, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. And in that unfolding drama, one thing became crystal clear. Even a monarch with centuries of preparation cannot fully predict how the heart will respond when family, duty, and principle collide. Imagine being caught in the middle of a battle you didn't choose, a conflict that wasn't yours, but where every decision around you shapes the course of your life. This is the position Archie and Lilibet now find themselves in. Two young children born into privilege, but also into extraordinary scrutiny, who have become the emotional epicenter of a family crisis that stretches across continents. At first glance, the idea that school fees could spark international headlines seems absurd. Yet, in the context of the royal family, education is never just education. It is status, it is legacy, it is access, and it is a reflection of belonging or exclusion. To understand why these children are at the center of this storm, we have to examine the dynamics of the family. Prince Harry, once the carefree boy running through palace gardens, has grown into a man who values independence, personal agency, and the right to make his own choices, even if they conflict with tradition. Meghan Markle, his wife, is fiercely protective of her family, determined to secure opportunities and stability for her children. Together, they have created a household thousands of miles from the monarchy, yet the gravitational pull of their heritage continues to exert immense influence over their lives. And at the heart of it all are Archie and Lilibet, symbols of both continuity and disruption. The children, in many ways, embody a paradox. On one hand, they are part of the royal lineage, heirs to centuries of history, and connected to one of the most scrutinized families in the world. On the other, they are being raised outside the traditional framework of royal life, immersed in a culture and environment that is very different from that of their cousins, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. This duality places them in a unique and precarious position. Every decision regarding their upbringing is loaded with significance, every choice scrutinized not just by family, but by the public and the media. The request for educational funding suddenly transformed from a practical matter into a question of identity. Who are these children, and what does it mean to belong to the royal family? For King Charles, the children's place in the family is both deeply personal and politically sensitive. Supporting their education could be seen as a gesture of love and inclusion, yet it could also be interpreted as preferential treatment, undermining his authority and the careful structure of succession and inheritance. Conversely, withholding support might signal disapproval or distance, potentially impacting relationships for years to come. According to insiders, the king was acutely aware that any decision would affect not just the children's future, but the perception of the monarchy itself. How do you reconcile fairness, duty, and emotion in a situation where every choice has a consequence? Public perception plays a central role in this dynamic. The world watches every royal decision, often interpreting gestures as moral or political statements. When it comes to children, the stakes are exponentially higher. Archie and Lilibet are not just young family members, they are symbols. Archie represents Harry's departure from tradition, the consequences of stepping away from royal life, and the blending of royal heritage with American independence. Lilibet, born after the couple's relocation to California, symbolizes continuity and connection, carrying the name of her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, while being raised far from the institutions that traditionally shape a royal upbringing. In this light, the request for financial support is more than tuition. It is a question of legitimacy, belonging, and recognition within a system that has strict, often invisible, rules. Insiders report that tensions over the children's education were compounded by comparisons to their cousins. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis attend elite institutions, supported by both public funds and private arrangements. For Harry and Meghan, the desire to provide a comparable environment for their children is understandable. Yet within the palace, the optics were delicate. How could the monarch reconcile the desire to treat all grandchildren fairly with the practical and symbolic implications of supporting children whose parents had deliberately distanced themselves from royal duties? This tension, insiders say, was a key factor in the king's deliberations. There is also the emotional dimension to consider. Children, unlike adults, cannot fully comprehend the complexities of family politics. They feel the consequences, however, in ways that can shape their perceptions of identity, loyalty, and self-worth. Archie and Lilibet, according to those close to the family, have been shielded from the worst of the conflict, yet the reverberations are unavoidable. Every decision regarding their schooling, residence, and public exposure carries weight, impacting not only their immediate environment, but their long-term relationship with their heritage. It is a delicate balance, protecting the innocence of children while navigating the often ruthless demands of tradition and public scrutiny. Another factor contributing to the centrality of Archie and Lilibet in this storm is the symbolism of their names. Lilibet, named after Queen Elizabeth II, represents continuity, respect for history, and the bond between past and present. Archie, while a more modern choice, carries the legacy of Harry's father and grandfather. These names are not just identifiers. They are statements about lineage, connection, and expectation. To deny or approve support for their education is, in a sense, to make a statement about the value placed on these connections. Insiders suggest that this symbolic dimension intensified the debate within the palace, creating layers of meaning that extended far beyond financial considerations. The children's geographical distance from the UK adds yet another layer of complexity. Being raised in California places them outside the daily life, rituals, and expectations of the monarchy. While this allows them certain freedoms, it also amplifies questions of belonging. Will they feel fully part of the family? Will they understand their heritage and responsibilities? How will the monarchy maintain influence and connection when the children are physically and culturally distant? These questions were reportedly central to the palace's deliberations and contributed to the pressure felt by the king and his advisors. Even within the family, the position of Archie and Lilibet has become a point of emotional tension. Sources suggest that conversations about the children often carry an undercurrent of unspoken accusation, worry, and frustration. The very act of requesting support is interpreted differently by different members. Some see it as reasonable and justified, others as a challenge or even a provocation. These interpretations are influenced not only by family history, but by media coverage, public sentiment, and personal values, creating a complex web of emotional and political dynamics that make the children central figures in a high-stakes drama. The media's role cannot be overstated. Every article, broadcast, and social media post magnifies the situation, turning what might have been a private discussion into a public spectacle. Commentary ranges from outrage to sympathy, and every new report adds pressure to an already tense situation. Archie and Lilibet, though entirely innocent, are drawn into this spotlight, becoming symbols in a narrative that is part family drama, part institutional crisis, and part global entertainment. According to palace sources, the couple's hope for discretion was quickly challenged by leaks, speculation, and intense media interest. The request for educational funding, in this context, becomes a lens through which we can understand multiple layers of tension between father and son, between institution and family, between tradition and modernity, and between private life and public scrutiny. Archie and Lilibet, as the subjects of this request, are placed at the very center of these intersecting forces. Every decision regarding their future is scrutinized not only for practical implications, but for symbolic meaning, historical resonance, and emotional impact. They have become, willingly or not, the focal point of a conflict that stretches across the Atlantic, bridging family, monarchy, and public perception. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this situation is the unintended consequences. Children are rarely responsible for the conflicts surrounding them, yet they bear the brunt of decisions made by adults. According to insiders, discussions of Archie and Lilibet's schooling revealed deep-seated anxieties within the family about legacy, loyalty, and identity. Will the children grow up feeling connected or alienated from their heritage? Will they internalize family tensions or maintain a sense of belonging and love? The implications are profound and long-lasting, shaping not only their immediate experience, but their understanding of family, duty, and their place in the world. Even beyond the family and institution, the request highlights broader societal issues: wealth, privilege, and the intersection of public and private life. Archie and Lilibet are emblematic of children whose lives straddle two worlds. One of extraordinary privilege and expectation, the other shaped by choices to live independently, outside traditional structures. Their experiences provide a microcosm for understanding broader questions about inheritance, identity, and opportunity, magnified by the intense gaze of public interest. In short, Archie and Lilibet have become the center of the storm not because of anything they have done, but because of what they represent. They are living symbols of heritage, connection, and expectation. Their existence challenges the monarchy to reconcile tradition with modernity, love with duty, and personal choice with public responsibility. They embody the emotional and symbolic stakes of a conflict that is at once deeply personal and profoundly public. And yet, insiders suggest, the most dramatic moments were still to come, because the children, despite being central to the request, were never the ones making decisions. But their future hung in the balance, subject to the choices of adults whose priorities were often in conflict. And according to multiple sources, the ripple effects of these choices would soon escalate beyond what anyone could have imagined. The question then becomes inevitable. How does a family navigate love and loyalty when every decision carries monumental consequences? How do parents protect their children while asserting independence? And how does a monarch balance personal affection with institutional responsibility? Archie and Lilibet, innocent yet pivotal, sit at the heart of these questions, their lives forever shaped by a request that seemed, at first, so simple, but turned out to be anything but. But what came next would intensify the drama, pulling every member of the family further into a storm that no one could control, and setting the stage for a confrontation that would leave lasting scars on hearts, relationships, and the very institution of monarchy itself. What happens when a family is forced to choose between unity and principle? When the very walls of a palace, built over centuries, become a battleground for ideology, loyalty, and emotion? That is precisely the situation inside Buckingham Palace as the request from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle for financial support for Archie and Lilibet's education sent ripples through the corridors of power. According to insiders, the palace did not respond as a single, united entity. Instead, it fractured into factions, each advocating a different approach, each interpreting the implications of the request through their own lens of loyalty, precedent, and fear. The divide, insiders suggest, was both philosophical and personal. On one side were those who argued for compassion, emphasizing the innocence of the children and the humanity of the request. They pointed out that Archie and Lilibet were not responsible for their parents' choices and should not be punished for the decisions Harry and Meghan had made in leaving the royal fold. "You cannot forget," one advisor reportedly said, "these are children. Whatever the parents have done, they are still the youngest generation of this family. To deny them seems cruel. This faction believed that a measured, generous response could demonstrate the monarchy's capacity for empathy, setting a moral example to the world and reinforcing the idea that family matters, even above protocol. On the other side, a different faction stressed principle, precedent, and perception. They argued that the king, now the reigning monarch, could not afford to appear soft or inconsistent. Supporting Harry and Meghan financially would risk setting a precedent for other family members, potentially opening the door to similar requests. It could also be perceived by the public as favoritism, undermining the credibility of the monarchy and exposing it to criticism over fairness and propriety. According to palace sources, these advisors were particularly vocal, reminding everyone that in a centuries-old institution, precedent is everything. Once a line is crossed, the ripple effects cannot easily be reversed. The debate reportedly became tense, with emotions running high behind closed doors. Advisors and senior staff described meetings that were lengthy, exhausting, and occasionally bitter. Some aides reportedly urged patience, cautioning that a measured response could prevent long-term damage. Others insisted that immediate clarity was essential, warning that any delay would create uncertainty, leaks, and speculation, factors that could inflame public opinion and strain internal relationships. The discussions were described as intense, painstaking, and fraught with emotion, with loyalty and principle colliding at every turn. Adding fuel to the fire was the personal history between Harry and his father. Their relationship had been shaped by decades of love, miscommunication, and tension. Harry's departure from the royal family, combined with public interviews and personal disclosures, had already created a fissure. Some palace staff reportedly felt that acceding to the request would reward behavior they considered rebellious or disrespectful. Others worried that a refusal might be interpreted as harsh or punitive, potentially widening the emotional chasm between father and son. In essence, the palace was grappling with not just a policy question but a deeply personal and emotional dilemma: how to reconcile love with responsibility, family with institution. The divide was further complicated by Meghan Markle's position. Insiders suggest that she was viewed through multiple, often conflicting lenses. Some staff saw her as a protective mother, focused on the welfare of her children and making a practical request. Others perceived her as a disruptor, whose influence over Harry complicated traditional lines of communication and protocol. Her role intensified the debates within the palace, introducing elements of mistrust, speculation, and strategic consideration. According to sources, conversations about the children often became conversations about the parents, and the parents' actions became inseparable from the perceived implications for the children. One of the most challenging aspects of this divide was the issue of messaging. Buckingham Palace operates not just as a household, but as a public institution, with every decision subject to interpretation by the press, analysts, and the global audience. The advisors tasked with shaping the king's response had to consider how the decision would be received publicly, how it would impact the monarchy's reputation, and how it would influence future interactions with family members. A compassionate approach could be spun as weakness. A firm refusal could be portrayed as cruelty. The stakes, in other words, were enormous. Insiders described the divide as a reflection of broader tensions within the palace itself. Some aides and advisors aligned closely with the king's personal instincts, emphasizing compassion and family loyalty. Others emphasized institutional stability, hierarchy, and adherence to tradition. These factions did not merely disagree. They debated intensely, each side presenting evidence, historical precedent, and moral arguments to support their position. Meetings were reportedly long, with advisors taking turns presenting scenarios, potential outcomes, and worst-case consequences. Emotion mingled with protocol, strategy mixed with sentiment, and every word carried weight. The consequences of this divide were felt not only internally but externally. Even before a formal response was delivered, rumors and leaks began to emerge. Media outlets speculated on the nature of the request, the king's potential reaction, and the impact on the children. Social media amplified every detail, turning private deliberations into public debate. According to palace insiders, This external pressure only heightened the internal divisions, as advisors sought to control the narrative while simultaneously managing the emotional and practical aspects of the situation. Adding complexity to the situation was the king's own perspective. Charles, according to sources, was aware of the divide but remained determined to balance empathy with principle. He understood the importance of demonstrating compassion while also safeguarding the integrity of the monarchy. His approach, reportedly, was deliberate and measured. He sought input from both sides, weighed the arguments, and reflected deeply on the implications of each possible course of action. This deliberation, while essential, also contributed to tension, as some advisors pressed for an immediate decision while others urged patience and caution. In the midst of this divide, the children remained, in a sense, innocent bystanders. Archie and Lilibet's futures were being discussed, debated, and decided by adults whose loyalties, perspectives, and emotions were often in conflict. Their needs, while central to the discussion, were filtered through layers of adult interpretation, strategy, and history. The result was a situation in which even a practical question, funding for education, became an emblem of broader conflicts. Generational tension, institutional authority, familial loyalty, and public perception. The divide also had emotional consequences for the king himself. According to insiders, he experienced moments of frustration, reflection, and sorrow, torn between the roles of father and monarch. In private, he reportedly considered the long-term impact of his decision on his relationship with Harry and Meghan, on the emotional well-being of his grandchildren, and on the legacy of his reign. These considerations were not abstract. They were deeply personal, shaping not only the decision but the way it would be delivered. As the debate within the palace intensified, a key issue emerged: how to communicate the decision without inflaming tensions further. Advisors discussed every word, every phrasing, every possible nuance. Should the response emphasize compassion, principle, or a balance of both? Should it be delivered directly to Harry and Meghan, or filtered through intermediaries? Every choice carried risk, and the pressure was immense. Insiders suggest that the king approached this task with extraordinary care, recognizing that a misstep could exacerbate the divide rather than resolve it. Ultimately, the palace divide was not simply a matter of disagreement. It was a reflection of the broader challenges facing the monarchy. The institution is built on centuries of tradition, hierarchy, and expectation, yet it is also deeply human, filled with emotions, loyalties, and personal histories. When these elements collide, even a single request for educational funding can expose fractures, ignite debates, and force leaders to confront dilemmas that have no easy answers. The king, advisors, and staff all found themselves navigating this precarious terrain, aware that the decisions they made would have profound and lasting consequences. But the divide was about more than policy or principle. It was about trust, loyalty, and the balance between love and duty. Each faction within the palace had its own perspective, informed by history, personal relationships, and professional responsibilities. The tension created an atmosphere of uncertainty, with each conversation potentially altering the trajectory of the family and the institution. And as the king prepared to communicate his decision, insiders say, the stakes had never been higher. Because according to multiple sources, once the decision was delivered, the reactions of the factions within the palace would set off a cascade of events, each more dramatic than the last. The divide, which had simmered in private meetings, was about to collide with the public, the media, and the emotional realities of the family itself. And what came next would force every member of the household to confront the consequences of their positions, their advice, and their loyalties in ways that no one could have anticipated. The question then became inevitable. Could the palace ever reunite around a single approach, or was this divide destined to deepen, shaping the family, the monarchy, and the lives of Archie and Lilibet for years to come? But what came next would test not only the institution's authority, but the very bonds of the family, and it would reveal truths that some insiders say were more shocking than anyone could have predicted. In every family, history has a way of following you, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a force that reshapes the present. In the British royal family, the shadow of past conflicts looms larger than most, stretching across generations, steeped in protocol, expectation, and deeply personal grievances. For King Charles, Prince Harry, and Meghan Markle, the request for financial support for Archie and Lilibet's education did not exist in a vacuum. It landed atop a complex history of miscommunication, public disputes, and private tensions, an accumulation of incidents that had already strained relationships to the breaking point. The story begins decades before Harry and Meghan even existed. King Charles, now in his 70s, has lived a life under extraordinary scrutiny, shaped by expectations from his parents, the public, and the institution he would eventually lead. His relationship with his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, was one of both reverence and pressure. From a young age, he was taught the importance of duty, decorum, and continuity. Every misstep was magnified, every success measured against centuries of precedent. This upbringing instilled in him a profound sense of responsibility, but it also carried an undercurrent of emotional complexity, a tension between personal desire and institutional expectation. These lessons, and their sometimes unspoken burdens, would later influence his interactions with his own children. For Prince Harry, these dynamics were both formative and fractious. Growing up in the shadow of an older brother, Prince William, and the intense public fascination surrounding Princess Diana, Harry developed a deep sensitivity to criticism and a strong desire for independence. He witnessed the highs and lows of the monarchy firsthand. The adulation, the scrutiny, the pressures that could crush or elevate a life in the public eye. As a child, he was deeply attached to his mother, Diana, whose untimely death left an indelible mark on his psyche. According to multiple sources, Harry's sense of vulnerability, combined with his desire to carve out his own path, would shape many of his adult decisions, including the choice to step back from royal duties. These personal histories collided in complex ways when Harry married Meghan Markle. Meghan herself brought a different background, perspective, and set of expectations. She had lived outside the royal bubble, experienced life as a public figure in Hollywood, and navigated her own professional and personal challenges under media scrutiny. Entering the royal family meant reconciling these experiences with centuries of tradition, a task that was far from simple. From the start, Meghan faced skepticism, gossip, and at times outright hostility from certain factions within the palace and the media. Harry, already sensitive to criticism and protective of his family, became her staunch defender, sometimes placing himself in conflict with the institution he was born into. These dynamics, historical, personal, and public, formed the backdrop for the educational funding request. According to palace insiders, memories of past conflicts influenced how advisors interpreted the request and how Charles himself approached the situation. Every word, gesture, and intention was filtered through the lens of history. Past interviews, public statements, reported disagreements, and even the media coverage of Meghan's entry into the family. These shadows of past conflicts intensified the pressure on the king and his advisors, making the decision not just a matter of policy, but a reckoning with unresolved tensions. One of the most significant historical shadows came from the public fallout of Harry and Meghan's departure. The couple's decision to step back from royal duties in 2020, often referred to as Megxit, had already triggered months of speculation, criticism, and public debate. According to insiders, the palace viewed this move as both practical and symbolic, a literal step away from tradition and a metaphorical step that challenged the authority and expectations of the monarchy. While Harry and Meghan framed their decision as necessary for mental health, independence, and family stability, the palace saw it through the prism of duty and precedent. This unresolved tension would inevitably color their subsequent interactions, including the discussion about funding their children's education. Another layer of historical context involved prior disagreements over finances and independence. According to multiple sources, there had been discussions and disputes over the funding of Harry and Meghan's ventures, including their charitable work and media endeavors. While these matters were often framed as practical considerations, they carried symbolic weight, reinforcing narratives about loyalty, entitlement, and responsibility. The education request, viewed through this lens, became a flashpoint, igniting both personal memories and institutional concerns. The media's role further complicated matters. In the years leading up to the request, Harry and Meghan had been at the center of intense media scrutiny, with stories ranging from allegations of favoritism to critiques of their lifestyle choices. Every prior controversy, every headline, every leaked detail added fuel to the fire, making the palace hypersensitive to potential optics. According to palace insiders, advisors repeatedly reminded the king that the public would interpret the educational funding request not just in isolation, but in the context of decades of reporting, speculation, and public judgment. The shadows of past conflicts were, in other words, magnified by the constant presence of media and public opinion. Personal history also played a critical role. Charles's relationship with Harry has been described as complex, marked by love, pride, frustration, and at times disappointment. Insiders suggest that unresolved conversations, perceived slights, and differences in perspective created emotional layers that could not be easily set aside. Every request, every discussion, every decision was filtered through these personal experiences, adding emotional weight to what might otherwise have been a simple financial consideration. For Meghan, the history was similarly complex. Her prior experiences with public scrutiny and familial skepticism influenced how she framed the request and how she interpreted the king's eventual response.